when I was about 8 years old, I remember watching a moth flutter around a lamp that had a shade around it. And I watched as that moth grew closer and closer to the lamp and eventually went inside the shade. And I remember seeing 30 seconds later smoke rising up from inside the lamp. A literal expression of a metaphor that actually happens quite rarely. But when it does happen, it's notable, like a moth drawn to flame. I'd like to share today a story that I don't share a lot, certainly in public, and a story that increasingly feels relevant for me to share for reasons that will become clear, and also which does relate to Passover and its themes of liberations in ways which will become clear. And after the story, I'm going to share a teaching from the Jewish tradition, and finally ask a few questions that I actually don't know the answers to, but hopefully we can explore together during the forum. So I was raised in a relatively culturally secular style of Judaism. I didn't have a lot of practice at home, but I did have a strong sense of community. And that song, Hine Ma Tov, we sang before, I came to realize the people I knew growing up today feel closer to family than to friends. That was the strongest transmission I received from my Jewish tradition, but it wasn't until I was a teenager that I first encountered what I would define at the time as spirituality, or sort of a meaningful version of the religious tradition on a personal level. And when I first found it, it was by walking almost accidentally into this mysticism class for teenagers taught by a modern Orthodox teacher. And in that first class, listening to her words, it was like something inside me woke up that I didn't even know was there, a sort of a love for that kind of study and those kinds of teachings. And my whole life started to change. I started being more traditionally observant of customs and rituals, and I gained a really strong passion for, at the time, what I would have described as getting to know God better. And when I use the word God today, certainly I don't mean any particular one thing. My personal relationship to what lies beyond the ordinary comes more from experience than theology, and if I use the word God today or at any other times, I just invite people to insert what works for them in that place, because at the end of the day, I encourage any people, when I speak or when I have personal students, I say, can you be an explorer? Can you be a scientist of reality? And I base my own beliefs or my own understandings of things that I've experienced, and I encourage everyone to do the same. And so I had quite an experience when I was 18. I had traveled after high school through Europe for several months and then to Israel, and had found my way to a seminary where we studied and danced and prayed and sang 16 hours a day. And when we weren't eating, we were sleeping, in theory, and I eventually was sleeping maybe about 5 hours a night because I was so excited to start each day, to wake up, and we would pray for an hour and a half, and I decided to push myself. I was going to wake up 45 minutes before the 6:30 a.m. prayer service and study mysticism and the secrets of Judaism with a colleague, and basically was striving to be the Jewish version of an enlightened being. And I was 18, and looking back on that time, one, I didn't have very good guidance on how to stay balanced within that. And two, there was a lot of pride involved in that journey, a lot of greed. This, desiring to be, the word in Hebrew is a tzaddik, a righteous person, but also in the sort of Kabbalah, mystical world, it meant someone who was really tuned in and, didn't need to sleep much or eat much. And so bread and salt was enough for breakfast and sometimes enough for lunch as well. Between all of those things put together, I started having some of these remarkable experiences, and I was really proud of myself and very excited. I remember after praying one time in the afternoon prayer service with the community, having an experience where there was a great sense of bliss in my heart, and having this feeling that though I hadn't realized it or I didn't normally notice it, God was everywhere at all times and interacting with us and with me at each moment. And it was strikingly beautiful, experiences like that. But over the course of the several months that I was in that seminary, and without much guidance from the elders and the teachers there, I started to get a bit shaky in my mental health. And it got to a place where I wasn't able to function very well, and I wasn't perceiving reality terribly accurately. By the time I returned, I was rescued almost on my return by family members. I ended up in a psych ward in Calgary, and I spent a couple of weeks there because I needed it. And I didn't know at the time, and it took me several years to really learn, it is possible to trigger mental illness through spiritual practice. And it's not a common thing, but given the right circumstances, perhaps the right genetics, the right practices, or the wrong practices, if you will, it's possible in trying to glimpse the beyond to actually open up a portal that is hard to close. And so it took me a couple of years to return to stability and health, and after that, several more years to even understand what had happened. I ended up finding a tremendously helpful mentor who was a transpersonal psychologist. It's a type of psychology that specializes in mysticism and people having altered states of experience and those kinds of things. And through working with her, I learned there's actually some very basic, simple steps that people can take in order to find that balance. So if sort of praying in an ecstatic way and studying sacred texts and all of that is like hitting the gas in the car, some people really benefit from hitting the gas. And there are some people, or maybe for each of us at different times, when what we need are the brakes in spirituality. And so for me, some of the things that I learned was, take a break. Literally, hit the brakes, take a break. If I'm having one of these magical moments, I need to actually stop doing the practice that caused it to happen. And that is counterintuitive. A lot of the books I was reading were all about how to expand and transcend and move further, and I didn't realize that it's possible to move too quickly. So simple things like taking a break. How about getting a good night's sleep? Or perhaps eating healthy food at regular intervals and getting exercise. That's some of the most fundamental practices for times or for people who they're not having a difficulty transcending, right? The balance is about taking care of our bodies, taking care of ourselves, and being in relationship to others as well, and learning how to be honest and authentic in a way that's connecting. So at that time in my life, I did not know that these teachings existed anywhere besides my transpersonal psychology sessions. But after deciding to go to a Buddhist university in Colorado a few years later, and feeling this sense of this call to be a rabbi that was very surprising to me, I sort of took the plunge into rabbinical school, and I guess that was about 7-8 years ago, and discovered through the course of my studies there that there was a whole language of grounded spirituality, of integrated spirituality within Judaism. And in fact, a lot of the teachings relate in one way or another to the Exodus story. Because Passover, as a holiday, is grounded in the narrative of the Israelites going from slavery in Egypt and then being liberated from beyond that point. And in Jewish mysticism, that state of slavery is into freedom is the central metaphor for moving beyond either difficulties in our lives, like being under a table and thinking we're a turkey prince, or moving from just ordinary reality, which, according to some, and I'm not having a judgment either way here, the expansiveness and of, beauty and transcendence, it feels like ordinariness can be kind of constricting as well sometimes. So that's the way the metaphor is played out. And so I want to share with you a teaching that is about this process. And maybe you've sort of noticed by now, or you haven't, that what I'm describing relates to the Turkey prince as well. That there was this prince who actually needed to be met and then to go gradually from one place to the other, that it couldn't happen all at once. And the wise man didn't come in and start dancing on top of the table and celebrating how great everything is in order to fix that. It was actually about this step-by-step process. And so the character of Moses is interpreted by a particular teacher in the Middle Ages as someone who had to take a gradual step as well in order to go from being a shepherd, which is what he was, which many of the prophets in Judaism are in fact, going from being a shepherd to a prophet. And we might be tempted to think that the prophets were sort of born that way, or they just became that instantly. But this medieval teacher, who I don't even need to know historically to know that this teacher had some kind of contact with spiritual experiences that went too far because of the way he describes Moses and what he says at the end. So this teaching is from Rabbi Bachya, means our teacher Bachya. He was alive in the 13th century. And he was inheriting a mystical tradition of Kabbalah very early on. And he says that when Moses is wandering with his herd and he sees the burning bush, he sees something that to Moses did not look like a miracle. It looked like a strange fire. This teaching says that if Moses, when he first saw the burning bush, he turns aside and goes closer, but if he had thought this was some kind of divine fire as opposed to a strange sight in nature, he would have walked the opposite direction. He would have been overwhelmed and overpowered and scared. And we can imagine the character of God in this moment having a certain wisdom. If we want to reach out to people and we want to help someone who's in a difficult situation, or even who we're wanting to relate to more deeply, it is possible to come on too strong. It is possible to overdo it and overdo the potential of a relationship by bearing all or by simply being too upfront. And so the teaching here is that Moses actually turns aside because he's curious about the fire. And the next thing that happens in this interpretation, it is an interpretation, if people know this story well in the Bible, there's a little bit of playfulness here in how the read is happening, but the next stage, according to Rabbeinu Bachya, is Moses encounters the voice of an angel, not God. Moses isn't ready for God. And after Moses interacts with the angel, according to this, his consciousness or his mind strengthens. I just find that language so interesting because, again, I have a lot of exposure to New Age philosophy today and those kinds of books, and some of them talk about expanding our consciousness a lot. And again, it can be that sense of expand, but this is saying is he had an expansive moment, and then he took a pause to strengthen his mind. It's not unlike working out. If we go to a gym and want to lift weights and we start with the heaviest weight, we're going to injure ourselves. But if we start with the weight that's just right, and it's going to push us a little bit, but it's not going to overwhelm us, we're going to do a few reps, a few sets, and we're going to put it down, and then we're going to rest, and we're going to take time. And what happens when we rest? Our muscles start to heal themselves, and in the healing, they strengthen and repair. That, according to this teaching, is how our minds and our souls work as well. They follow the same set of rules. So Moses has his mind strengthened, and only then, finally, is he able to have this encounter with deep reality, which again causes him to expand, but then take a pause and to strengthen once more his mind. And if this is a teaching that I had been exposed to at the age of 18, I could have saved myself a lot of suffering and my family as well. And I think it's such a valuable teaching. And it ends with the words, matters of the mind correspond to matters of nature. What happens to the mind is like what happens to the senses. That in the same way that if we were in a cave and then we left the cave all of a sudden, we might be blinded from the light. that's the way that our minds, our hearts, our nervous systems work also, that it takes time when we're adjusting from one context to the next, and they follow the same set of norms. So the question I want to ask for everyone today is if that can be how our inner worlds work, this gradual step-by-step process, and that can also be how our bodies work. Yeah, that we can take time to heal and repair between strenuous activities, or our ears adjusting to noise and those kinds of things. Are there ways in which broader society and culture work like that as well? That is there a sense of wisdom to an intentional pacing when we think about changing our world for the better? I think some examples that I could draw on, to me, I'm not really talking about those in this instance. When I think about someone, again, like the Turkey Prince, that's an emergency situation. I'm not talking about pacing. When people are telling stories about bringing refugees here, that's not what I'm talking about. That is the pace of immigration that we're dealing with, and we're trying to go as quickly as possible. I'm thinking about more subtle issues, and I'm gonna sing a song for everyone in a moment of nigun, a Jewish wordless melody, and I'm gonna invite everyone to join along. But I want to share a story, one last example from my own life that I see as a more subtle issue, just to seed that in the discussion. And of course, in the forum, it sounds like this will be my first forum here, but everyone gets to say whatever they please. But I want to end with a question. My first class in rabbinical school, my teacher started with, very first day, he says, by the end of these 5 years, you're not going to have so many answers, but you're going to have some really good questions. So this is a recent example that I send, my son is in grade 3, and he goes to a public school, and I really love that. I really love that he's in a public school, and it's inherently pluralistic. And he comes back from school on February 14th, and he says, Dad, I was really embarrassed today because I didn't have any cards to give out to people. And my wife and I hadn't even considered that because it's not in our mind. We don't celebrate Valentine's Day in our family. I'm not against it. It didn't even occur to me. And here he had this sort of embarrassing, he had to kind of hide somewhere socially in class, and it felt really, really painful. And I think about that, and I think about things like what I think in a very pluralistic sense people refer to as the holiday season, which is Christmas/Hanukkah often is what people mean, and that being a step forward in our sort of shared holiday space. But if I were to be honest, as a rabbi or as a Jewish person, this is the holiday season for us. It's coming up, Passover or September, right? High holidays. This is the holiday season, and so I have a choice. Let's say as a member of the school community, I can advocate for the dissolution of all religious holidays in the name of true pluralism, or I can maybe be a little bit more relational or more communicative and understand that whatever we're doing here, this great Western experiment of many different cultures and religions and faiths and ethnicities coming together, that it is a longer process. And personally, I can speak for myself, and only for myself here, I don't have a great desire to rock the boat right now. I don't have a great desire to be an advocate for the dissolution of holidays that I think are pretty great for a lot of people. I don't, even in public settings, personally, and that is my relationship to this kind of pacing question in the public sphere. And I know I'm not alone in my perspective, but I also know that there's lots of other perspectives out there. So in light of the idea of the wisdom of a gradual transformation, I want to ask more broadly, what is the time and the place for that kind of mentality in our society right now? And when is it time to move forward with great haste and gusto? Thank you.